Hey, yo, welcome back to another edition of Science Notebook with Nickel. Here we go. Today, we're going to look at ecosystems. Ecosystems. So an ecosystem, eco means home actually, so it's basically the system of our Earth, our home, and really it's like the home of plants and animals is what we consider to be ecosystems. And so when we look at ecosystems, they are affected when we remove trees from a place, we're affecting that ecosystem. And when we divert water into a new place, we're affecting that ecosystem. Or if even a beaver builds a dam, they're affecting that ecosystem by turning the river into a pond. So a lot of ecosystems are affected by humans and animals and the way that we just live on this earth and other animals live on this earth. And so something that we find with ecosystems is that they have all of our resources. They have our plants and our animals. And so we can actually define something that we call ecosystem services. And this basically relates to the fact that ecosystems provide services for humans and animals so that we can thrive and prosper. And so if we were to define this, we would say the ecosystem services are the variety of benefits that humans freely gain from a properly functioning ecosystem within the natural environment. So an ecosystem service, again, are the types of things, the services, the variety of benefits. The variety of benefits that humans freely, and when we say freely, it means that we're not putting money into that. We're not having to spend anything. It's just a well-functioning ecosystem will create benefits for humans. So it's the variety of benefits that humans freely gain from properly functioning ecosystems within the natural environment. All right, so ecosystem services are things, there's really 4 different categories, but the categories are things that you can really dig into more, that if you're interested in understanding how different ecosystems provide different services, this is something that you could study in college and really go on to be a professional with. If you're interested in a career like this, where you can actually look at ecosystems that do things like, let's write some examples. Like, for example, nutrient recycling. And essentially what that means is, like, if you have a dead tree that falls down, well, that dead tree would just stay there forever if it wasn't for all the little insects that live on it and the little mushrooms that grow on it to help cause it to decompose, and the grasses that grow on it, and use those resources that once were the tree to build new materials. So you have nutrient recycling that occurs. And then that also helps soil formation, because soil is just basically a bunch of old decomposed stuff into its littlest pieces, and that's what we call soil. That's why plants can grow really well in it, because there's a lot of nutrients there. Some other examples of ecosystem services are just things like food. So for example, when you have a good, nice functioning ecosystem, food is going to grow in those ecosystems. So those are things, that could be apples, or it could even just be like a spinach leaf, things that we eat, or it could be an animal, like for example, if we had a pheasant. So let's try to draw here a pheasant or some type of bird that could be eaten as food. Let's give it some legs there. Okay. So you get the point that we have food in an ecosystem because we can then hunt and gather in those types of ecosystems. Another thing, it would just be something like energy. What I mean by energy is if you have a nice flowing river, and if we were to put a dam in that river, or if we were to have the river turn a big wheel, that wheel can then turn a turbine, which we can then use to get energy from. So it'd be like a waterfall and we have a wheel that's there. So we can get energy. We can also get energy in the way of trees. Like, so example, if you cut down trees, you can create a fire. And we can use those fires to heat our homes or to cook food. So we can get energy from those ecosystems. And honestly, some other things is just enjoyment. So if you've ever been out in the mountains, I know I like to spend my time out in the mountains. And if you ever get out there in the mountains, or maybe you're out on the water, or maybe you go spend some time in a forest, or you go to the ocean, we can get a lot of excitement and enjoyment, just peace of mind from going out into nature. So what we find then is that in these ecosystems, we have to really have a properly functioning ecosystem. So if we just plant a whole forest full of the exact same tree, there's not a lot of variety in that ecosystem for different types of birds, for different types of plants to come in. And even when all of that stuff dies, you don't have enough variety to really have enough decomposition to cause the nutrient recycling or the soil formation to happen. And so another important aspect of an ecosystem service and to have a properly functioning ecosystem is something that we call biodiversity. And as we learned on the last couple pages, is that bio means life. And so if we talk about biodiversity, it means diversity of life. And what we learn here with biodiversity, well, let's define it first. And it basically is just all the living organisms that live in an area. And this is things from huge trees to small microbes. So let's say from huge trees to small microbes and beyond. Okay. Now, what we find then is that we can have a lot of biodiversity or a little bit of biodiversity depending on the number or the different types of living things, living organisms that live in an area. And so if you have a lot of different life, that equals high biodiversity. And if you have a lot of the same types of life, it equals a low biodiversity. All right, well, like I said earlier, if you have a lot or a high biodiversity, it actually means that you have more strength in an ecosystem, because if you have a lot of living things there, if one thing dies, it's not going to completely destroy the food chain. The food chain will be resilient enough that it can still continue on if something were to happen to the ecosystem. So we can actually look at how biodiversity affects the health, and let's draw some arrows here and say that if we increase biodiversity, so if you have a high amount of biodiversity, it means that you have increased strength of an ecosystem and health in an ecosystem. And if you have low biodiversity, you can probably guess what that means, and that you will decline the lands. So you're going to decrease the strength and health. So if we turn a forest, which has a lot of biodiversity, lots of different plants, it would mean it's nice and strong, into a farm field, which doesn't have a lot of biodiversity because it'll only have a few weeds and maybe a lot of corn or soybeans or whatever that one crop is that we're growing. We actually decrease the strength and the health of that ecosystem. Not as many animals could live in that type of environment. So as we look at how humans are impacting the earth, it's important to remember that in order for us to be able to get benefits from our ecosystems, they have to be properly functioning. When they properly function, we get a lot of great things from our ecosystems. But as biodiversity is affected and the number of living things and the amount of living things that are in an ecosystem is changed, the strength and the health of those ecosystems change. So what that means then is that the services that we get from the ecosystems are not going to be as good. They're not going to work as well. So as we pave a surface and we destroy the biodiversity, or as we build homes in a forest or in a prairie or in a grassland where there once was high biodiversity, we're decreasing the biodiversity, which we're then impacting the ecosystems. Well, that's all for me this time. Put me on your news feed, Insta-tweet this so that everyone can see how ecosystems are super important for life. Science is life, and I'm out. Peace.